Brendon McCullum, England's under fire coach, is set to stay as the man in charge of all formats. But is that the right decision? Have the ECB made the right decision for the betterment of England cricket? Well, that's what we're going to explore today on this video, where we take a deep dive into Brendon McCullum, Robert Key, Ben Stokes, England cricket, and we find out what happens next. My name is Sab. This is the Clean Bold podcast. Stick around. Make sure you give this video a like. Make sure you give it a share and hit that subscribe button as we go deep diving on what happens next. On March the 23rd, 2026, after a post-Ashes review, the ECB have decided to keep Brendon McCullum as their coach. In fact, the coach for all formats. They're also going to keep Ben Stokes as their test captain. Harry Brook will remain as the one-day captain. And Rob Key will still remain as managing director of the team. Now, that is after review after their Ashes horror show where they lost again, this time 4-1 to Australia. And of course, they recently exited the T20 World Cup with a very narrow and thrilling semi-final loss to India. Now, the ECB director Richard Gold has admitted that the decision may not be popular, but they believe that this is the right route and the right direction to go for the England cricket team. Well, that's what today's video is all about. It's also called What Happens Next. Well, we know for one part what happens next. Brendon McCullum stays, but what's the wider journey here? What's the wider story? What are the wider consequences? I think this has taken a lot of people by surprise. We knew that there was going to be a deep internal review into the state of things, not just in the test team, but a wider look of English cricket. This always tends to happen after an Ashes debacle. It usually happens after they get beaten in Australia. So it happens pretty much every 3-4 years because that's how often England go to Australia, and they pretty much always go there and get thrashed. Now, this Ashes, as we all know, was hyped to the max, as it's going to be the biggest Ashes series for almost a decade, certainly since the 2010-2011 Ashes, the last time England won in Australia. So it was hyped up as England's best chance to win an Ashes series. It's going to be the closest Ashes series in a generation. It's going to be the most feisty and most exciting series in 20 years, certainly since the 2005. So all this hyperbole, all this hype, only for England to lose the Ashes in the earliest possible time. Remember, they lost the first 3 tests. They lost the first test within 2 days. So, so much hype, all for nothing. Thousands of England fans travelling over to Australia, spending lots and lots of hard-earned money. Look, going to sporting events is not cheap these days. So, factoring flights to Australia, hotels, all that stuff. So, a lot of hard-working people spent hard-earned money to go and watch England, and they were thrashed. Humiliated, really, after all that hype. And they were at pains to tell us that, remember, this is not a great Australia team, and they wanted to throw that reason out every possibility. Just remember, this is not the greatest Australian team. Well, that makes it even worse. If, as you say, England, if this is not the greatest Australian team of all time, the fact that you still lost 4-1 to them is really then an embarrassment. Off-field issues, the drinking culture, Harry Brook getting punched by a bouncer in New Zealand before that, which wasn't even reported until during that series. It was the lack of preparation, the arrogant lack of preparation, drinking trips to Noosa. So much went wrong for England. Whatever could go wrong went wrong for England, and they were pitiful on the field, pitiful off the field. The arrogance in not wanting to play a proper tour match, denying the chance to play tour games in Australia when they had the chance to, and they deservedly got beaten 4-1. So whenever England lose in Australia, which they regularly do, they always have an internal review. Now, there are lots of reports that maybe this time there weren't going to be this deep internal review where everybody gets sacked and everybody loses a job and they have to reset again, because they've thought that that's sort of part of the problem and they keep having to have a reset. And that reset is pretty much why Ben Stokes and Brendon McCullum came into the fore in the first place. Remember back to 2017 and then 2020 and all that time, England were in a real dire state then. They were not even winning test matches. They were at the lowest ebb for many, many years when Joe Root was captain. So after that Ashes debacle, where I think they lost 4-0 then, or 4-1. Anyway, they got battered then. It doesn't really matter what the scoreline was. But that's when Stokes and McCullum got brought in. And I imagine they were planning and the preparation always leading to this Ashes, and nothing really changed. And it was all built up with this new style. Bazball is the term that everybody's been using for the last 4 years. But yeah, look, let's get into this. I mean, because this is not really about whether McCullum is a good coach. And I think you have to be honest in certain aspects. I'm not trying to be overly critical or just criticize him for the sake of it. And I can admit, look, he did change England for the better when he arrived in 2022. Well, they were in the doldrums then. But the real question now is whether England, the ECB, and the powers that be have mistaken past disruption for future progress. Because, in my opinion, keeping McCullum after what happened in the winter feels like less conviction and more like a gamble that the same leadership team can suddenly fix the very culture and habits and tactics that it created. This culture and the vibes and all this playing golf and we don't want to tour. Sorry, we don't want to have any touring games. We don't want to have too much practice. But then saying we practiced too much and all of that stuff, that was engineered by Brendon McCullum. It's not like someone else put that in charge. He wanted it to do that way. He decided, along with the people around him, that this was the best way to head into an Ashes. So sticking with him and then hoping when we haven't seen any real adaptations or changes seems a bit crazy to me. It's that old saying, isn't it? Keep doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results is the height of madness. We see that in football. When managers do this, when leadership people do this, they lose their job. Ruben Amorim at Manchester United was so wedded to his back three format, and I know this is not about football, but bear with me. He was so married to his back three system that clearly didn't work, but he kept insisting that that's what I'm going to do. And Man United got worse and worse and worse and worse. Eventually, he lost his job because he just kept doing the same thing without any real progress or result. In fact, things were getting worse. So what happens next for Brendon McCullum and England? The ECB, they've made their decision. There's no reset, no clear public reckoning. There's no big names falling on the sword. McCullum stays, Stokes stays, Key stays. For me, that's why this feels really unacceptable and unsatisfactory. Not because England have actually lost an Ashes series. That happens. England, that's what they do. Australia beat England in Australia. That just happens, right? England have lost many Ashes series before this. It's because of the way that they lost. The same flaws kept repeating themselves. The culture's been questioned. The preparation has been questioned because it was appalling. The selection has been questioned. And after all this, after a huge review for the last few months since England left Australia, what we've come to in terms of conclusion is, well, we'll just carry on with the same people. So why have the ECB kept him? Well, their case for them is pretty clear on their behalf. McCullum has a contract that runs through to the end of the next World Cup, the 2027 ODI World Cup. So first and foremost, removing him is not going to be cheap. He's on reportedly £1 million a year. Removing him early from that contract is going to become expensive for England. The board is on the opinion that he still has control of the dressing room. He still has a lot of favour in the dressing room. He's still liked in the dressing room and respected, and that he is the coach that can get the best out of the current group of England players. That is exactly what Rob Key has said. He's been doing the media rounds this week. And he has said that he's the man who can get the best out of the players in this country. Third, the ECB don't want another total reset. Like I said, this is what normally happens when England get battered in Australia. There's a reset. Everybody has to go. New group comes in. And then we build up to an Ashes. They get battered again. New people come in. So it's just an endless vicious cycle. So Richard Goulding has explicitly explained that they're not going to select or deselect management based on a popularity campaign. He said, look, it would have been easy to sack Brendon McCullum, but that's why they didn't want to do it, because it wasn't easy. My argument would be, it may not be easy, it may have been easy, but it may also have been right. But, who or do I know? There's maybe more of a sympathetic version of the argument under McCullum and Stokes. England have become more entertaining, more watchable. I think, to be fair, coming into the series, a lot of people were saying, look, it's the most evenly matched Ashes in a while. There was a lot of excitement, certainly from the England side. That's how they were hyping it. And I think on some level, that's not wrong. I think a lot of cricket fans, even if you don't support England or Australia like I don't, I did think that this was quite an evenly matched England side. And actually, a few people thought that England probably had the edge over Australia. England had a lot of injuries on the Australian side with Cummins out, Hazelwood out, so missing quite a lot of key players in that bowling attack. A lot of injuries in there, a lot of uncertainty about who they're going to pick. Whereas England came with a bit more settled. So certainly England's bowling attack seemed on paper anyway to be maybe slightly ahead of Australia's. And I think we actually saw that on day one of the first test. England's bowling attack was a lot quicker, was a lot more, feistier than Australia. So that seemed to be the case. But then it just completely fell apart. Before they took over, England had only won 4 out of 20 tests from January 2021 to the start of the 2022 home summer. So from June 2022 to the start of the last Ashes, they won 25, they lost 14 and drew 2. So that is a real transformation in results, a lot more higher in terms of win percentages, and England become more of a winning side. So ECB can point to that. There were genuine changes under McCullum. You can't argue with that. You can't argue with those stats. Stats never lie. So the ECB is essentially saying, look, the winter was bad, but in terms of the bigger picture, it's still good enough to trust this leadership group. The biggest issue here, and where the problem really rises, because continuity only really works when the people who are staying in charge have shown that they actually understand what they're doing wrong and have shown that they can learn and adapt from those changes and that they're capable of meaningful change. And I would argue that the evidence has shown us that Brendon McCullum is not capable of adapting in the modern test climate. When he came on, this new style was that it was just a new style that nobody had kind of really seen before in test cricket. And that's why it probably caught a few teams out. England did have some notable wins against New Zealand. They had a notable win against India in 2022. They went to Pakistan and whitewashed them. So these are notable wins. But I think the style was new to a lot of teams that they probably struggling. And actually, I will also say this, in a lot of games, England were the second best team for a lot of test matches. They were second best for 3-4 days. But what would happen is teams would set them scores like 370, 380 to win. And you would normally think that's more than enough to win. But with England's new style, they were able to spook bowlers. So I think that's how England won quite a lot of their games under Brendon McCullum in that first period of time. But it's clear that test teams and teams will work out how to get around that, which teams have. When England went to India under Stokes, they won the first test, fair play, brilliant win. But then they just couldn't adapt. India ended up winning 4-1. And you can't play one way all the time. And that is how England have been. Brendon McCullum has been so quick to defend his tactics that they're not just a vibes-only team. But we've seen like Stuart Broad come out and say, look, this is how they've been encouraged to play. Doesn't matter if you get out. I want to see you hit fours. I want to hear sixes. I want to see you play this blasé, carefree cricket. Okay, cool. Getting that mindset is one thing, but there's sometimes in game situations where you shouldn't play that. And we've seen that. And Harry Brook is probably the best example of that. A player blessed with so much talent, but playing in such a crazy way and kamikaze way in certain situations where it's not required for. If you're chasing or the other team has scored 400 or 500 in the first innings, and you trail by 300, 400 runs and you're 100 for 5, does it make sense to keep going and batting that way to try and get out of it? No. In a test match, it's all about skill. That's why it's called a test match. It's a test of your skills in different situations. So sometimes you've got to knuckle down, grind it out, bat sensibly, ones or twos. Yes, you can still score that way. Grind the opposition down, fight your way back into it. England have not shown really that they're capable of that. And Brendon McCullum has clearly shown that he doesn't have that. I mean, look, he didn't have much test experience as a coach before he came into the England job. And I'm not holding that against him. You've got to start somewhere. But that's not sustainable. And we've clearly seen in this last year and a half, 2 years, that it isn't sustainable. But if you can't adapt and you can't play different ways, then I'm sorry, this gig is not for you, which is why this doesn't make any sense to me. And after the Ashes or during the Ashes, Nasser Hussain asked Brendon McCullum, will you adapt or can you or do you believe that you're able to adapt? And Brendon McCullum's answer was, I'm a little bit offended by your question. But never really answered the question. Yeah, he might be offended by it, but it's a perfectly good and valid question to ask because you haven't shown any case of adaptability. And that's why this team is struggling. So this is the biggest issue. It sends the wrong message in terms of accountability. Geoffrey Boycott, England legend, very outspoken individual in the cricketing world, he's asked the obvious question in his article online, saying, where is the accountability? Former captain Michael Vaughan said, there's not many management groups in the world who will deliver something so poor from home in an Ashes series and still get to carry on. Michael Atherton has said the lack of accountability is hard to stomach. Now, that isn't just media noise, and I know Ben Stokes before the series called all these people dinosaurs and, like to throw little jibes like that at people, but they're right. These are three series former captains of England pointing to the same thing. They're not stupid. That what they're saying is valid. How can there be no accountability for such a horrendous performance after so much hype and build-up? It's just staggering, really. And there's no evidence to suggest that anything is going to change. If nobody pays the price for failure, then what standard are England setting? Now, this matters because sport isn't just vibes. It's not about identity or any kind of narrative here. I think, there needs to be consequences at high-level sport. England are one of the top teams in world cricket. There's consequences. There should be consequences at high-level sport. Doesn't matter about whether you like somebody or they make you feel good and stuff like that. Ultimately, sport should be about winning. I mean, that's what I have been raised on and believe. England never seem like they want a challenge for the World Test Championship. Why? I don't know. The final is always in England. It's always at Lords or, it's always at least in England. But England have shown no care or desire to actually challenge for that World Test Championship. And that, for me, is part of the problem because all the other Test teams, including the other two, Australia and India, I mean, whether or not they get there, their goal at the start of each cycle is to make the World Test Championship final. Australia have made 2. India have made 2. England have made none. And they've been very open about that they don't care. That might be something that you say knowing that you can't win it. But I think that's part of the problem. You can't just be trying to be entertaining. At some point, fans will want you to win. There's no point going and being entertained for 2, 3, 4 days in a test match if you end up losing. That's just frustration. And that kind of patience and early enthusiasm has waned. England went to Australia with such a big rhetoric about how they're going to perform, and they got badly exposed. How can you go there thinking that you don't need any preparation? And we saw then, towards the end, that I think they upped their preparation with the coaches doing extra work, and then a brand new bowling coach was drafted in. So again, just shoddy preparation. When we came to the white ball test match, England were offered the chance to play a practice practice pink ball test match. Senior players declined and sent reserve bowlers to go and prepare. And obviously they got battered because Australia are the leading team when it comes to pink ball tests, day and night tests. England are trying to get that removed from the next Ashes series, which is just pathetic. Honestly, that's a complete cop-out, disgraceful attempt by England. If that gets done, I mean, that just shows you how how this current management is. They're so weak, Whether or not you like day and night test matches is regardless of the point. They're part of the game. Now, I quite like them. I think they're a good new addition to Test cricket. But look, they may not be for everybody. But they're part of the game. Just because you get battered when you play it, learn how to play it. If you have the option to play test matches or practice games in that format, not taking them and then being dumbfounded when you get thrashed in that format, it is just ridiculous. It's not always someone else's fault. You've got to look internally. And England clearly are not very good at that. This review is pretty staggering when you think that Rob Key and Brendon McCullum have both kept their jobs. I think probably Ben Stokes keeping his job probably is the right thing. I think he probably is a leader that England needs. Whether or not everybody follows his word and can step up to it the same way he does is another debate. Bazball era looked pretty revolutionary when England were beating weaker or less settled teams, especially at home. Well, it looked revolutionary when it started because it was a new style of cricket that nobody had kind of seen before. So that I can't dismiss, and that's why everybody kind of loved it when it first came into being. But the tougher the opposition, the more that romance is worn off, and you can't argue with that against either. Now, CricBuzz released some numbers that show that, let me read this out. So since 2022, England's test win rate was 72.22% from 2022 to 2023. But from the start of 2024, it dropped to 46.43%. Or tellingly, Against Australia and India in that period, England have only won 7 of 21 tests, losing 12. And against everybody else, they've won 19 out of 25. So, what does that tell you, really? It tells you that England beat the so called lesser teams or weaker teams, i.e., the teams that England should be beating. So have we made a lot about a nothing, just kind of getting a bit carried away with results? I won't go that far. That seems a bit incendiary, but I think, beating West Indies at home, beating Pakistan away. Look, I think Pakistan, especially at that point, were really in a lot of transition, a lot of turbulence, a lot of issues going on in their cricket at that time. But look, going to Pakistan and winning 3-0 is a huge achievement. I'm not trying to take that away. But England are one of the big three, but I feel like they're quite far behind India and Australia in terms of their setups and quality of their teams. And they've never beaten India since Brendon McCullum has been coach and Stokes has been captain. And they've never beaten Australia. See, even when Australia come to England, they still put up a fight. In fact, the last 2 series in England have both been 2-2. Great series for the neutral to watch. Great series for both sets of fans. But England haven't even beaten Australia in England. So that tells you what are they actually trying to give. And look, the last series was a thrilling one. They could have won another day with one rained-off test match. But still, stats to stats, they haven't beaten Australia in England or Australia. They haven't beaten India in England or India. So this kind of tells me that this Bazball method hasn't worked. And England have got nowhere near a World Test Championship final. As I said, they don't seem even interested, which baffles me. What are you doing if you're not trying to win something? You literally have a trophy and a tournament that you can win in the Test match arena. Your goal should be always to win that, especially if the final is at home. But England don't seem interested. That and the fact that they don't win enough to even get anywhere close to it are the two things. So the central case here for the ECB's decision, yes, McCullum's method have raised England's ceiling for entertainment, if you like, but their competitiveness on the big stage hasn't gone up really for my liking, and I'm not even an England fan. So the Ashes review is not just about tactics either. It's about behaviour and the culture that's been engineered within the dressing room. So I'm talking about standards and preparation and the general whole feel of the team. Now, The Guardian reported that the winter brought some major scrutiny to England's environment. Obviously, they had that mid-break sort of stay in Noosa. There were headlines about drinking, Harry Brooks' drunken altercation in New Zealand. Now, they called that incident significantly unprofessional. I mean Richard Gould of the ECB. The regime had tightened things up with a midnight curfew. Okay. So that tells me that, the previous environment had gone too far in the wrong direction. The culture was wrong. There was even a report that Brendon McCullum prefers guys who like a drink, who like to play golf, who like to chill. That's the kind of people he likes to integrate. And then there were cliques being formed, which didn't sit well with Ben Stokes. There were reports of a rift between captain and coach. So you don't introduce strict parameters into a team unless you know that the old ones have failed. And clearly, McCullum didn't see an issue with the way they were doing things, is the big point I'm trying to make. He didn't see any issue and was always very quick to defend the way they were doing it. As I said, there was a really baffling thing when they were talking about, I think it was after the second test, as I said, refused to play in a practice match for the pink ball test. And when he was interviewed about the lack of preparation, his response to that was, if anything, we've prepared too much. Very David Brent office-style response. So, yeah, just a baffling response to that you've prepared too much. Well, clearly you haven't given it any preparation, so you can't say that. Now, when I did the Cricket News episode that you may have seen, if you haven't, go and watch that. There was a segment where we talked about Liam Livingstone's recent criticism. So his feeling was that the current regime doesn't care about players who are outside of the group. Summed up saying that nobody cares about you once you're dropped, was how he felt. But again, that sort of shows the kind of cliquey nature of the group, and again, how they're selecting players and how they're treating players. Geoffrey Boycott likened it to a boys' club. So I think when lots of people are sort of saying the same thing, that many people can't be wrong. Johnny Bairstow has come out very recently and said, let's criticize the group. Ollie Pope has come out and said something. So it just seems that they're all is not well within that camp. a lot of the same people are getting chances. I mean, Zach Crawley, again, is a player who's been maligned. He's been attacked in the media for his lack of runs, for his average, and he seems to be remaining as the opener for England, despite not really delivering much in his time as England opener. Ben Duckett's form is kind of worrying. He's pulled out of the IPL now in order to kind of, in words of it, save his England career. Ollie Pope, well, look, he was going down the same route, but he has been dropped now in the favour of Jacob Bethel, and that could be the end of his England career. I don't know that for sure, but certainly as a number 3, there's no chance Ollie Pope is going to usurp Jacob Bethel. Shoaib Bashir is another one. Backed as England's number 1 spinner, but didn't play a single game, and they suddenly fly in Will Jacks and other people to make up. So it doesn't make any sense. One of the things that Brendon McCullum has been tasked to do is to have better relationship with the county setup in England. And again, one of the strongest signs here that the model wasn't working is there has been a widening gap between England and the county team. Wisden had reported that there was a disconnect between the England setup and the counties had grown wider over the Brendon McCullum and Robert Key era. County voices had complained over a lack of clarity over what domestic players need to do to earn selection. Surrey coach Gareth Batty said the pathway had been misted over, and Rory Burns mocked the sense that a couple of innings and a few shots on Instagram could suddenly put you in contention. That sort of speaks to the wider set that Livingston and Bairstow have spoken about, and Pope has spoken about recently, that they don't know what it is they need to do to get into the team. They have their own people that they like and they just keep them. And that means kind of you're playing county cricket. A lot of those guys will dream of playing for England, but have no idea how to get into the England team. If you're not one of the boys, you're not getting in. People who are performing well don't seem to be getting a look in either. England and its county should have a intrinsically linked relationship. They should be hand in hand with each other. Because how are you producing the next cricketers then? How are you going to do? But you can't always just, I don't know. You can't just be shipping players who want to call back players from South Africa or New Zealand or other countries, which happens quite a lot in England. Because if the county coaches and players don't believe that selection is coherent, then it's not just bad optics that England are risking. They're weakening the pipeline, they're damaging the trust, and then the domestic game's going to suffer because then players think, well, there's no point. I can't make it into the England team. I'm going to go and play franchise cricket, and I'm not available for selection. I don't want to play for England. It probably won't be far away, I don't think, from a player actually coming out and saying, well, look, I'm not available for selection. Look, okay, this may not be the best example, but look at Ben White in the England football team. Literally said, I'm not available for selection. And it's only now been brought back since that coach has gone. So could that happen in cricket? Could county players be saying, look, I'm not going to play for this current setup again? Liam Livingstone has said he's probably never going to play under this regime again, and he has a soured relationship because of the way he feels he's been treated. Johnny Bairstow, again. Here's the big example, James Anderson. England's greatest ever fast bowler. The way he was treated. Are you seriously telling me that England couldn't still do without him? He's 40-odd years old, still doing it for Lancashire. And I still think he's probably a better bowler than most of what England currently have. Producer, I'm not saying he was maybe not as good as he used to be, but certainly he can still do a fantastic job. And I think, again, he would have still been a great bowler in this current lineup and could still do it. So forced out of the team for no reason when he clearly didn't want to leave, again, just speaks to the current climate. If the evidence is telling you that your methods aren't working out, especially against the crunch, in the crunch matches against the better teams, then change is just not a sense of betrayal of that. It's just the smart thing to do. Michael Vaughan's warning on this has been very sharp and very clear. Stubbornness is useful in sport, but it's dangerous when you're believing that you're right all the time, is what he said. And I think that's where England are at the real risk of kind of going downwards, because what England don't want to do now, which, well, they are keeping him in charge, but what if results don't improve? What if they are continuing to do this? So look, let's look at what they have coming up. They've got a home series against New Zealand and Pakistan. I think probably they may win both of those. They have a one-day series and T20 series against India. That could go either way in England. And I think they're going to Australia for the 150th centenary test next year. And then they got the Ashes next year as well. how quickly this came around. And then they got the 2027 ODI World Cup. England's white ball team is not in the best of places either. If they were to win those series, is that just going to paper over the cracks and everything is going to be all right again? I'm not saying they need to abandon all of their methods, but we've seen with some of their players that they're being almost coached in a way where the traditional and technical elements and basic elements of Test match cricket are being coached out of them. Jamie Smith is a fine example. He's such a tremendous player, such a talented player, but it feels like he's being coached in a different way where that basic level of Test cricket is being taken away from. When you look at Joe Root, England's greatest ever batsman, how going away from the Bazball style and just keeping his natural game, how he's still scoring run after run after run. He's still scoring century after century. He's on track to break Sachin Tendulkar's record in the next 2 or 3 years. Jacob Bethel, what a fan. Well, he's played his own natural game, which is perfect for Test cricket. So the board keeps talking about the need to adapt, the need to evolve. But how do they adapt? Evolve into what? The public examination after this review requires better county communication, stricter standards and behaviour, more fast bowling support. Now, all of that sounds pretty sensible, but a lot of them just feel like a list of things that should have already been put in place. The fact that this has only been doing now tells you how bad these things are. If you know that these are the issues in the team, why are they only being putting in now? Why does it take another Ashes battering for that to change? So I think that's why a lot of England fans are disappointed with this review, because it's a lot of buzzwords, or reform and adapting and evolve and changing this and changing that, admitting to mistakes, but no serious consequences are happening. You can't afford to make mistakes at this level in sport. It says that England have learned the lessons. How? What lessons have been learned? Rob Key has said, Brendon McCullum has shown that he can adapt. When has he shown that he can adapt? He's shown us that he can't adapt. That's why they're in this position. So I don't understand what this means. It just feels like a bit of a boys' club, like we heard from Boycott. The strongest defence that he's still England's best coach, and sacking him would create chaos. But some of that may be true, but I think it misses the bigger issue, because it's not even about whether he can coach. It's whether England need more of this influence and if he's the right man for England. And I personally don't think that he is anymore. I think he's shown that. I think he was shown that in the way he led and prepared the team for the Ashes. That is a huge amount of red flags heading into such a big series. That should tell them this man is not right to lead this team. In terms of how they select players, in terms of how they set up for games, how they play in a game, how they're being told to play in the game. There's so many issues there that we've seen over a period of time. Forget the Ashes. The England series against India in 2025 summer. That last game at the Oval, okay, it's one of the greatest Test matches of all time. India did deserve something from the Test match and the Test match series as a whole. But that last game, England needed 35 runs with 6 wickets left or something like that. How do you lose from that position? They shouldn't, because nobody knew how to play that situation calmly. Jamie Smith's head completely gone. Nobody knew how to do it. Once Joe Root fell, it just felt everybody went. Nobody knew what to do. And after that, there's only going to be one winner. That can't happen. That shouldn't happen. The way in which England lose, it just crazy collapses. How do you lose a Test match in 2 days? Sometimes the right decision isn't always to burn everything down, but the wrong decision can be to, not change things when they need to. And I worry that England will look back at this as a bad decision and it's going to set them back. So the pressure now shifts completely, because England's next Test assignment is in June. It's a home series against New Zealand as I said, in June. Then you've got white ball matches against India. Now, because ECB have doubled down on this and doubled down very publicly, there's only buffer left. So if England look like they're a slapdash team, if their culture feels a bit loose, selections is poor again, if the cricket against good opposition feels off or anything, then the decision to keep McCullum is going to look really bad and really, really stupid and ultimately negligent. And I think actually that is the right word to use about this current England management team. They've been negligent. Negligent to their fans, negligent to their players, and negligent to anyone involved in that system, the county system. But this is the risk that they've chosen by sticking to Brendon McCullum. He has not shown any evidence and anything to suggest that he can adapt and change his style. Look, maybe in 6 or 9 months' time, I'm sitting here saying, well, look, I was wrong about Brendon McCullum. And if so, I will admit that. Of course I will. But this is the board taking a huge risk, and now they're having to placate to the public. They are now all in on the same leadership team, so there's no more excuses left. I would personally think that the ship has sailed, but apparently they're in this position where now this is it. No more excuses, no more protection, no more hiding behind what Bazball used to be. They've promised that they're going to do it, but I don't know. Well, let's just see. Look, Brendon McCullum has done some good to English cricket, the Test team. You can't deny that. He's changed them. He's made them relevant again. He made them dangerous again, made them entertaining and compelling for a period of time. But changing a team and completing a team are not the same thing, okay? And ultimately, it should be about winning. Results are the only thing that matter in professional sport. It's the only thing that matters in most parts of life, but especially for a professional sportsman, a leader of a professional sports team, you should be judged on only one thing, and that's results. You are going to be given time. He was given that time, but now he's under pressure to deliver. So let's see. I don't really know, because I feel like he could paper over the cracks quite easily. New Zealand, they could beat conceivably at home. They could beat Pakistan at home in a Test series. They could even edge an Ashes series at home next year. So then everything is fine, right? After that. But what happens when they go to Australia next and they lose 4-1 or 5-0 again? What happens then? England's one-day team is not in a particularly good place. In fact, I think they're ranked so low in the ODI rankings that they might need to go through a qualifier just to get to the World Cup. So what happens if he doesn't deliver in that World Cup? He's contracted that next year, so it's a big year and a bit for Brendon McCullum. Is he going to make it to the World Cup? I don't know. But there's no harm in having two different coaches for two different formats. England should know that. Keeping him on as the coach seems really confusing. And yeah, it just seems, and people are quite upset about this, and I think rightly so. A lot of England supporters were just fed up after what they saw in Australia. Same old, and when they were promised so much difference, to just go to Australia to be battered again in the way that they're doing, and again, quote, by not a great Australian team. And look, even I would say, look, this isn't on par with the greatest Australian teams. It's littered still with great Australian players, but I think if you're being critical, they were missing Josh Hazlewood, they were missing with Cummins, a lot of aging players, but there's still a great Australian team full with great players, obviously, So, but the way England went into that series, the way they were told to go into that series, the way they were told to prepare for that series, raised big alarm bells and big serious questions. And I think that kind of should unequivocally have said that Brendon McCullum is not capable of leading this England team anymore in the Test environment. White ball might be a different issue. I would say this is similar to the Gautam Gambhir situation in India. He might be better suited to a white ball setup with the style and his sort of prowess in that format of the game. But he's been clearly shown he's slightly out of his depth when it comes to Test match cricket. And sometimes that is the case. Sometimes you just are better suited to one format. When the evidence is so compelling that he is out of his depth and challenging at the highest level of Test cricket, why would you persist with that? When he's clearly shown that he can't adapt and would prefer to double down on his methods and admit he's got things wrong. But look, what do you guys think? England fans, I want to hear from you. Brendon McCullum, are you happy with him being reinstated? My understanding is that not a lot of people are. They think it's a bit of a joke. I feel it's a bit of a joke. It's a pretty crazy decision. But what do you think, England? How much longer does Brendon McCullum have? Can he make it till next year? Rob Key, he seems to be not blameless in all of this, but I think he can hide behind McCullum a little bit. But should England have a big reset and throw out people and then, get a new coach? If that was the case, who would you like to be coach of England? That's another interesting debate. I'd love to hear what you guys think about who should manage England if it's not Brendon McCullum. I personally think Ben Stokes should remain as captain. But let's see. Let's see what unfolds for England and what happens next. We do know, though, that Brendon McCullum is going to remain as their coach for all formats for now. Rob Key also keeps his job. So same old for England. but are we going to get new results? There's only one way to find out. Thank you very much for watching this first episode of What Happens Next. I'm very keen to hear and see what happens next. And my name is Sab. This has been the Clean Ball Podcast. Make sure you give this video a like. Make sure you give it a share. Hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you next time.